Hey there, welcome to School of Emo, the podcast where we dive into the world of emo, pop punk, and everything in between. If you've ever found yourself in your car screaming the lyrics to Taking Back Sunday, wearing way too much eyeliner in the early 2000s, adding a buckle or a chain to every outfit you've put on, you are in the right place. I'm Erin Judge, and each week I will be your fellow student, guiding you through the music, the culture, and the history that shaped an entire generation of angsty teens. I am not the teacher of this school. I am a fellow student, here to learn alongside you and from you. Together, we will cover a lot of information that doesn't really matter, but will remind us of the days of stalking MySpace channels and getting lost in chat rooms. So connect your dial-up, turn on your webcam, and let's go to School of Emo. Welcome back to School of Emo. Last week, we were in the 1980s in Washington, D.C. with Rites of Spring. This week, we're going to take it to the early 90s, just a little bit later, and we're going to Seattle, Washington, and we are going to talk about sunny day real estate. Long before emo was a defined genre, before the scene was what we knew it to be today, this four-piece band was setting the stage and creating a template for this kind of melodic, vulnerable Midwest emo that we saw through the rest of the 90s into the 2000s, and even influencing artists and bands and songs today. And like Rites of Spring, this band was kind of here and then gone, but their influence in the industry, influence in the genre has surpassed even the work that they did as a band. Now, Rites of Spring was truly like a blip in time and didn't really give us that much beyond the influence. Whereas Sunny Day Real Estate was more on again, off again, kind of off now, but could always come back because they are known. It's almost like that toxic relationship, that ex you just keep going back to. They are here, they take it away, they bring it back, they take it away. And that is just who they have become. But their influence has carried on into bands like Used, My Chemical Romance, Dashboard Confessional, Hawthorne Heights, all of these emo bands that we know and love so much through the third wave and beyond. And one of their like biggest influence moments was with their debut album that we will get into, but Diary, which was 1994, was considered the greatest emo album of all time by publications like The Rolling Stone, which is a big deal, like the greatest. And we can debate that, right? We've talked about this throughout every episode of this podcast. Like every one of us is going to define emo differently. Every one of us is probably going to have a different emo band that we would say is the greatest, or an album we would say is the greatest, a song that we would say is the anthem. And there is going to be a bit of a difference between what was happening on the East Coast versus the West Coast, and what we talked about even with Rites of Spring. And then we even talked about with Thursday, right? In like the East Coast area. And then we saw with Taking Back Sunday in Long Island and the rise of Brand New. We have My Chemical Romance in that space. We have The Used. We have other bands in like the Midwest, Hawthorne Heights kind of throughout the Midwest, this West Coast part, and what we're seeing here in Seattle today. There's going to be differences in these different styles, and the people that were in the underground scene that may have experienced the bands, experienced all of this in real time, they're going to tell a different tale, right? So we probably will see Rites of Spring as like the emo band. And some people, as we talked about in the last episode, said that that's where emo started and ended, and it was done, right? I don't think that that's true. We see the same with the Sunny Day Real Estate world, where some people will say that they are the founders of emo, just like Rites of Spring. They never considered themselves emo, but they definitely went about it in a different way than what we saw with Rites of Spring. So what we saw happening in Washington, D.C., as we covered last week, was the rise of this kind of post-hardcore scene. So definitely coming out of like the heavy punk scene and this like post-hardcore emotional vulnerability overlap, which is where that emotional hardcore, then termed emo, kind of phrase even came from, which is what connected to that movement and what was happening there. Now in Seattle, this was a little bit different. So the 90s Seattle scene was a little bit less like definitely some punk. So there was punk involved. And you would still consider Sunny Day Real Estate to come out of the punk scene, the underground scene, but it was less hardcore. So we're thinking like punk, maybe a softer punk. And so the place of Sunny Day Real Estate was definitely more of like an emotional punk, but a softness versus a heavy, heavy hardcore vibe. Now, live, very different, right? The hardcore or kind of scene underground live looked a lot different than recorded. So there's only so much we can take from the recorded first album and what we have there. But live, there was definitely a lot more energy, but there's less like screaming. It's less angsty, less rough. Even the sound of the guitar and the bass and the drum, it's a different presentation of this vulnerability coming out of this kind of punk post-hardcore space in the like 80s to 90s than what we even saw with Rites of Spring, which was very unique at the time, for sure. I mean, going into the early 90s, like emotional vulnerability in music even wasn't always highly regarded. It wasn't as welcomed. And to go against the grain a bit with lyricism and performance, like opening your heart up on the stage, connected in a very intimate way to the audience, like it's unique, right? Especially in this scene. And that's something that Sunny Day Real Estate did really well and truly didn't receive the praise that they deserved for it until later on. They're not dead, but we can think about that like the Van Gogh, right? An art of it wasn't appreciated until much later, not in the moment of being created, which we will see kind of as a tied thread to some of the ups and downs that the band faced throughout their history. And maybe if things had been different, like, right, maybe if they had come onto the scene at a time where they could have gotten praise in the moment, like maybe we would have a different Sunny Day Real Estate today than we do. I think it's something that's worth considering, even though we can't really change the past. And as you'll see with some of the band members and what they decided to go on and do, there were a lot of fates that needed to be aligned in their own way. So maybe it could have never been changed. So our story begins in 1992 in Seattle, Washington, also the year that I was born. So a very special year for me. This was the time of grunge punk, was definitely there, especially in Seattle. And so 4 members decided to form this band called Empty Set, which then went on to be Sunny Day Real Estate. But they started as Empty Set. And that was with Dan Horner, who was on guitar, Nate Mendel on bass, drummer William Goldsmith. And then that was it for a while. So Horner was doing the vocals. But then they brought in Jeremy Enoch, who did vocals, and he really changed their sound and gave them that unique secret sauce as a band to go on and do what they did with their first album. So he was higher pitched, he was emotionally charged, he added a bit of dimension, and he created a lot more of that softness compared to Horner, who was a lot more kind of rough and hardcore, which I think is so special about this band in the midst of this scene in this space, which makes sense as influencing bands like Dashboard Confessional and Hawthorne Heights. Like there's a softness to them, even though there is still a hardcore, post-hardcore underlying tone, it's softer. And that's likely because of Jeremy Enoch and his role in the band. So he took over singing, and then Mendel had left for a little bit. We'll talk about that. And then he came back, and that's where they then decided, okay, this 4-piece group, they performed as Empty Set. They did that for a little bit, but then they went on to solidify themselves as Sunny Day Real Estate. Even in the early days, they really wanted to create something different. They wanted to stand out of the scene that they were part of and what they kind of were seeing around them. And they were inspired by the cathartic intensity of the DC punk emo bands like Rites of Spring. So there's some inspiration there, but they wanted it to be more Northwest, in the twist of the Northwest. So slower tempos, more melody, dynamic contrast. And you definitely see that even in their first album. If you compare, and I encourage you to do this, I did this. I'm learning about these bands all in real time myself, which is really exciting. But if you compare the first, like the Rites of Spring album compared to the first Sunny Day Real Estate album, you can see the influence there. You can also see that specific change, those specific focal points to create a different approach or create a different perspective and a different sound compared to Rites of Spring, which is so beautiful because these waves came together and were able to influence bands that then went on to be more theatrical and get into performance differently and just blend sounds like, you know, we had never heard before in the 2000s. So it was so necessary. And they were part of that by creating their own sound and bringing this kind of slower, softer vibe to the scene at the time. The bassist, Nate Mendel, later recalled in an Inlander interview, talking about like their mission and starting the band. We just wanted to be different. We wanted the music to sound overwhelming. So he said that he wanted to find songs that could pick you up and spin you around with equal parts beauty and aggression. One key that they focus on was this kind of quiet, loud dynamic that you definitely hear in the first album. You also hear it even beyond. I think that part has stayed true, even though they did go on to experiment as they grew and, produced music down the road. But there's that gentle swirling guitar passages that explode into this kind of hardcore fury, this bit of angst, which live was definitely dramatized, or it came to life a lot more because of Inique's emotional voice and just the way that he performed and the way that he really did, like some people mentioned, like cut his heart open. It's like open heart surgery on a stage that then influenced a lot of the emo music to follow. Horner later talked about this and said that their sonic palette blended the soft swirling melodicism with angst-filled punk fury and extremely emotionally charged confessional lyricism, which is a great way to describe it. I listened to all their albums, like preparing for this, and throughout all of them, especially through the first, like all I wanted to do was just stand and sway and not even like listen to the lyrics, which is really interesting. I think in a comparison to the lyricism of like Dashboard Confessional down the line, right? You're listening so strongly to the lyrics. They did a really interesting thing where their lyrics were solid, very emotionally vulnerable, but their sound, it didn't necessarily make you want to just like bounce up and down. It was like it has this sway to it. I can imagine myself, at an early show, like swaying and then just like hitting that like that deep thing that we all feel at these shows, right? And with these bands, which makes us come alive. And the addiction that we get for these shows and these concerts feels as connected. We get energy from it. Like you can kind of feel it and see, and it's like, it touches the brain differently. It's very interesting. I'm about to go to the beach and listening to their albums. Like this would be the perfect like emo beach music, where it's like it's calm and relaxing in a way. Like the angst isn't as heavy. It's different, which is really refreshing in this space. And now I feel the draw to like, I want to read more of the lyrics and see what else is kind of beneath that first layer, because the lyrics aren't the first thing that stands out to me. Now, you may have experienced that differently, and I'd love to hear your experience if you did. So early on, the chemistry that this band had and the kind of their sound, how they were standing apart, they caught the attention of Sub Pop Records co-founder Jonathan Poneman, who saw one of their first Seattle shows. And even though they hadn't had a lot of like live experience yet, he knew that they had something special. So he signed them on the spot, like right away. So that's their first setup with Sub Pop, who they stayed with for the majority, I guess you could say, of their career in terms of their albums. And so they went to Chicago to record their debut album with producer Brad Wood barely a year after forming. So came together, found their sound pretty quickly, went off to Chicago, like already signed to a record label, and created this album that we now, or some people would say, is now the greatest emo album of all time. And that was Diary. This was done in 1994, released in 1994. At the time, the kind of emo space, emotional hardcore kind of phrase, term, all of that, it was mostly only known, and like these bands were mostly only known in these kind of smaller punk circles. But with Diary, this opened the door to the indie space. And you hear that. That's kind of the thing I was talking about. The sound is different where it's like you want to sway. It has a different, it's kind of a different undertone, like a different feel to it that is a little bit stronger in the indie space. Like you could probably call them like indie punk, maybe. And so not only were like the Rites of Spring in this kind of punk space, hardcore space, Diary and Sunny Day Real Estate coming onto the scene opened a door to the indie space, which allowed them to reach more people and get more positive feedback even early on. So the band didn't expect that. And this grew and became, they got way more recognition even further down the road. But this little young new band quickly became able to be in the spotlight if they wanted to be. But they refused to posture or embrace this kind of rock star cliche. They wanted to be more mysterious. They didn't do a lot of publicity. They didn't do many interviews. It says they granted just one single interview during the Diary era. They really, really wanted the music to speak for itself. Now, was that the smart move? Could they have had more success if they pushed it out? I think it was a different time, right? The early 90s. This was pre-internet time, right? So, who knows what it could have done, but the music did stand on its own and is likely why this album has stood the test of time and influenced so many bands after. Like when we look at bands like, Burt McCracken of the Used said this, where this is one of his favorite bands and what the people that he looked up to. My Chemical Romance was influenced by this band, which you can hear if you listen to this album Diary and you compare that to the first My Chem album, you hear it, right? You can hear the influence there. And maybe the punk side of Sunny Day Real Estate is their ability to let their music be what it is and not try to become something they weren't. Like they weren't trying to commercialize any of this, right? They weren't trying to like push their album to be like the greatest of all time. They wanted the music to be present, to connect, to stand on its own. And it did. So this is where we got songs like Seven and In Circles, which showcase their dynamic range, the hushed, achy melodies to the cathartic crescendos. And that really helped them with their exposure and like really pushed them forward. I personally like In Circles a lot. That's probably one of my favorites on the first album. Seven is regarded as one of the best songs. And I pulled some of the Seven lyrics. It says, "Sew it on, face the fool, December's tragic drive, when time is poetry and stolen the world outside. The waiting could crush my heart. Sew it on, face the fool. The tide breaks, a wave of fear, and brave songs disappear. To the secret voice of dawn, this last time, raise my eyes. You'll taste it in time. 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 The right words in time. The right words in time. Sew it on, face the fool. The mirrors lie. Those aren't my eyes. Destroy them. Raise my hand. Reflected in savage shards. A new face, a soul reborn. It reads very poetic. That could be a poem on its own. It has some mystery to it. It's not as in your face as we even saw, To Follow in bands like, again, Dashboard Confessional. You'll see why I'm pulling them out so much, but it's not so angsty, it's not political. It is introspective, but it's kind of this creative, poetic introspection, which I find really interesting and again very intriguing. It draws me in. I want to understand it. I want to know more, which is what kind of grew their fan base early on. In September of 1994, they found themselves performing seven. So very quick. So right, they like 1992 were forming. 1993, is that what we said? Like they released the album, or 1994. So 1993 they were creating their album. 1993 they or 1994 they released the album. In that year, they performed seven on MTV's 120 Minutes and even on the Jon Stewart Show. So they were able to gather national TV attention very quickly as a brand new on the scene band straight out of Seattle. And that allowed these kind of introverted Seattle kids to be thrust into the spotlight in kind of this alternative rock, post-hardcore space. And this is where a lot of this scene was also transitioning, as we talked about in the origins of emo, right? This was kind of that second wave in the 90s, which led into the MTV space, the Warped Tour space, LimeWire, MySpace, like all of that was going to start forming, pushing into the third wave, which is where emo really exploded. So they were right on the cusp of emo exploding. They were right there, which makes them such a trailblazer in the scene as a whole, and also being in the right place at the right time with the right sound that people were craving, that they were looking for. Now, one reviewer at the time that talked about this album, they were talking about this album and how it impacted the genre of emo and what we know of emo. It said that this made emo accessible, fusing the gnarled guitars and nakedly emotional vocals with more than a hint of melodic Seattle grunge, which is exactly what it did. And it's that beauty and aggression combination, the delicate with that kind of explosive, loud shift that they were hoping to form and that they kind of solidified as their own very early on. Now, looking at kind of more of the personal lyrics and the personal vulnerable side of the songs, Jeremy Enoch later revealed that the songs were, "My entire record is inspired by a high school girlfriend that broke my heart daily." So heartbreak, teenage heartbreak, which is what fueled the emo genre early on and continues to. So even though this early album did allow them more attention than most bands get within their first few years, they were still a small band. They had a passionate cult following. They were big in that underground space. They did tour. They toured hard in 1994. They were able to join some bigger, acts and be part of that, but they refused to compromise their principles. Like they declined to play a big industry concert in Los Angeles kind of early on. Dan Horner refused to take the stage at a KROQ radio Christmas show that year, leaving the rest of the band to perform as a trio without him. They wanted to have this kind of uncompromising integrity connected to the music that they really cared about and had, so much respect for in a scene that then they didn't know at the time that they were creating, but that really gave them this kind of status of heroes in this space. But the problem is that this would not fully last, and that behind the scenes, they were paving a path for many others to follow. They were starting the Midwest emo phase of the emo waves, but everything behind the scenes began to unravel. And that's where we got the Pink album and the first breakup in the mid 90s. So by late 1994, they should have been like on top of the world, right? They should have been headlining their own tours. Like they should have been with huge bands. Like they had the foundation to be a giant success in that space. Their debut album was a success. Fans were present, they were connected, they were ready for whatever came next. But because the band was under a lot of strain, tensions were brewing, as what we see with many of these bands. And they were trying to create the follow-up album. This is kind of their thing. I'm very curious what is happening in this room. Like we saw this even with Under Oath, right? We talked about how they even mentioned this, their latest album is like the first one that like they did well, like people were happy, no one punched a hole in the wall, like the tensions were actually lower. I think most bands maybe just deal with like high tensions in this space. Who knows? I guess bringing together all these like vulnerable emo kids to try to create something together, maybe that's just set up to be volatile. But they had a lot of issues, and some rumors were swirling among the fans that Jeremy Enig's sudden conversion to Christianity was causing conflict within the group. So by late 1994, he had had this kind of profound religious awakening, which seemed to distance him from his bandmates. And by early 1995, there was shocking news that hit the music world, and that was that Sunny Day Real Estate were disbanding barely a year after their debut without their follow-up album. They had so much momentum. They were about to be at their peak, so it seemed, and they were just done. And fans were left shocked and bewildered, wondering like why. And there was a lot of speculation. So for many years, there was speculation about why they broke up so abruptly, like what was happening. Most pinned the blame on Enig's faith, and said that the pressures of a rock lifestyle clashed with his newfound spiritual path. Like maybe that was the reason. In an open letter at the time, he addressed the rumors and said, "I took a shot on calling upon God. He answered me. My pain was gone. I was full of joy. I had hope again," explaining how his faith had uplifted him. He professed his belief in the true God, Jesus Christ, even declaring, "I would be a fool to say that he hasn't worked miracles in my life." So he downplayed the idea that his religion and his faith alone had broken up the band, and he didn't really see that as incompatible with his music. And so, as time went on and those rumors settled a little bit, or at least he was able to open maybe other conversations, it was later revealed by William Goldsmith in the band that the band had already talked about splitting even before their first national tour, largely due to internal disagreements and stress. So just not handling the weight of the stress and what came with it. And a lot of that was because they hadn't necessarily reached and achieved major commercial success. Like they were successful in the underground space. They, started a new movement that would go on to be popular, but not necessarily a moneymaker. We haven't seen the money behind emo until what we saw with the theatrical side, commercialization in the third wave, and then probably even what we see today more than what we saw back then. So I'm sure like they probably were overworking, they were touring a lot, they maybe didn't have a lot of money behind it, and they, were stressed and there was a lot going on. By 1995, Goldsmith said that Enoch simply desired to leave the band. The others were frustrated and it just made sense. They just couldn't do it. There's too much tension. It was volatile. They were trying to create the next album. They didn't want to be there. And they decided to let it go. So fans were grieving the breakup. But something interesting, fascinating, is that Sub Pop, so their record label at the time, actually had an album to release because they had all of the songs that they had been working on for the next album. The band didn't necessarily want to like finish it and like put it out, but the label decided to. And it was the no title, no liner notes, plain solid pink cover album that was highly mysterious and self-titled as Sunny Day Real Estate at the time, but then became known as LP2 or the Pink Album later on. And the truth is that the album was just assembled from the unfinished recording sessions that preceded the breakup. And the band, who was already checked out, provided no artwork, no song titles, nothing to the label. So they decided just to go with it. And William Goldsmith, again, the drummer at the time, said that he just told the label to make it pink because they had nothing else to offer. They were just done. I connect to this so deeply. I have a nutrition practice in my real job, my real life outside of this, and, running my own business and being online and doing all the stuff with that. Sometimes I just get so overstimulated that even if I'm working on something, I just have to be done. Like I just let it go. It's not even worth it anymore. Like when the creative process is no longer enjoyable and you're just so overstimulated, overworked, stressed, overwhelmed, like you just don't care anymore. Like that's what was happening here. I think many of us can connect to that, especially in this world, because that's why we're connected so much to the music. So unfortunately, the Pink album, was released when the band wasn't even there. And so it felt like an artifact from a band that no longer existed. And, some people liked it, but it definitely didn't perform well, or it's not a highly streamed album even today. And Jeremy Enoch, recalled in an interview in 2008, so much, much later, he said, "We broke up and we just felt like we were done. On a lot of songs on the Pink album, there aren't lyrics. We never sat down to write them because we just wanted to get it out of the way as fast as possible. So I just sang a lot of gibberish." So not meaningful, didn't connect, makes sense. But interesting when you think about where the band was at the time and what they were going through. Like it's very interesting. And I think in some ways it's kind of beautiful. Like if you listen to the Pink album, you can hear the kind of disillusionment during recording, like the mumbled vocals, like that disconnect, the fragmented nature of the songs in the album as a whole. Like you can feel something really interesting and vulnerable even in that. And that's what fans did enjoy and they were able to connect with and hold on to, because it has this like very clear connection to what the band was experiencing, even if they weren't putting their all into it. Them not putting their all into it created kind of a sound and an album reflective of what they were experiencing at the time. One journalist described Diary and LP2 as underappreciated gems, the kind of albums where every riff and every word seems like the most important thing in the world at the moment. Like Van Gogh and what I alluded to earlier, after the breakup, Sunny Day Real Estate became more myth than band, and they became this kind of a legend that was adored, some said more in death than life, and began to influence so many bands that then hit the scene. So when the band was broken up, fans began to comb through every bit of information they could find. They looked at the cryptic lyrics, the rare photos. They were trying to understand like these people, what they created and why they were gone. And unintentionally breaking up was the most buzzworthy thing that Sunny Day Real Estate could have done, because they rose highly in popularity. And again, this was the mid 90s. This is where chat rooms, MySpace, like these things were starting to hit the scene. Like these things were starting to open up. People were connecting more than just at shows, right? They were connecting in online spaces, which allowed for this kind of virality that today happens in a snap. But then, took some time, and it took this kind of mysterious situation and all these different kind of theories. And then the album kind of being released after the band was done, like all these things for the band to kind of hit that level of success, if you will. So while this kind of mystique grew and all this was happening in the fan world and in the chat rooms, the former band members moved on to different lives. So Jeremy Enoch, he was still grappling with his faith. He had the loss of his band. He actually went on to record a solo album in 1996 titled Return of the Frog Queen, which was a dramatic departure featuring more orchestral arrangements, Baroque pop influences, like leaning into that kind of poetic side of his own nature and his style. Dan Horner walked away from the music industry entirely, retreating to a farm in rural Washington state to live a quieter life. He became a farmer, a very emo thing to do. Just like go into like your private world. I want to do that. And then the rhythm section found a very interesting gig. Nate Mendel and William Goldsmith joined Foo Fighters, which was started by Dave Grohl, the former Nirvana drummer, who decided to form Foo Fighters in the wake of Kurt Cobain's death. So, two members of Sunny Day Real Estate were thrust into the world of mainstream rock, which not many people saw coming. Now, this was early, right? So, this wasn't the Foo Fighters we know of today, but this is the Foo Fighters that were gaining in popularity and were taking off. These band members were part of that. Now, Goldsmith would depart the Foo Fighters by 1997, so he wasn't there that long. And there's a lot of theories on what was going on during that second album recording. We'll get to that a little bit more. But that kind of shoved, I guess, if you will, Goldsmith out of the way. But Mendel stayed on and became a fixture of the Foo Fighters and continues to be to this day. But his start was in Sunny Day Real Estate. And it seemed like at the time, they had gone on to have their own success. We had the Solo, we had the Farmer. And it seemed like by the mid-90s, Sunny Day Real Estate was done. The story of Rites of Spring. They closed the chapters that they had. The story was over. But then came the reunion and the next on again of the band. So after the breakup, their legend grew. But by 1997, the first two albums were being passed around like sacred texts among the emo and indie rock circles. So they had this cult status already, and that began to grow. And there was more of a demand for their music, which caught the attention of Sub Pop records, obviously for money. That's the whole point there. Record labels, that's what they're there for. So they approached Jeremy Enoch and Dan Horner that year and said, how about we release a Sunny Day Real Estate Rarities compilation? And so there were 7-inch singles, a couple of unreleased studio tracks, some live recordings that were sitting in a vault at the time that hadn't been used. And so for Sub Pop, this was a chance to kind of capitalize on the underground popularity that had grown, like continue making money from it. And kind of awkward, but they wanted to like tie up loose ends, like squeeze out everything that they could. Now, Enoch and Horner hadn't even spoken like much at all since the breakup. And they still decided, okay, they agreed to the project and they decided to jam together again and record a few new songs to include on the compilation. So to complete the project. So the planned compilation was very quickly scrapped. And instead, they decided that Sunny Day Real Estate would make a full new studio album. And then they formally reunited in 1997 as a full band again, which shocked and delighted the fans alike. Like came out of left field, right? Not expected at all. Now, the only person from the original lineup that wasn't around for the next chapter fully was Nate Mendel, because he was with Foo Fighters. So he was going to join in on the reunion. He intended to rejoin Sunny Day Real Estate full time, like he intended to. And he was part of writing some of the new material in 1997. So he was part of the album early on and in the writing process. However, the Foo Fighters were growing. They were on the brink of the stardom that we know of them today. And so he was back and forth, but then he decided a week before the recording sessions that he couldn't do it and that he was going to stick it out with Foo Fighters. And he later admitted that he didn't want to abandon what he had with the Foo Fighters for what felt like a potentially fragile reunion, which is fair. And honestly, he chose the right thing. Like he saw the future of what would happen. And if we look back and see, okay, the paths that each band took, like he made the right choice for himself and he is still with them. So it was definitely the right choice. He had more money and stability with the Foo Fighters. And like, why would you ignore that? And especially after you'd been like burned by this group of people, right? They had given up on the band, trying to make the last album kind of out of nowhere, like didn't stick it out. Like, why would you trust these people? And I find this so interesting with this band. I think a lot of bands probably have this type of relationship, but we see some bands that talk about themselves as like brotherhood or like a family and truly deeply connected and best friends and, always there for each other. This band didn't seem to have that type of experience with each other. They didn't seem to hate each other. And there wasn't the same drama, that we saw with like Taking Back Sunday, then the Brand New, like all that stuff. But there were definitely some toxic, if you will, clashing personalities, some things going on that created a lot of tension. And he was right not to trust it. So he bowed out at the last minute, which left Sunny Day Real Estate as a trio. And they decided just to keep pressing on. So they were going to rename the band for a little bit. And then they decided the music was still Sunny Day Real Estate at its core, even without Mendel. And he, gave them their blessing to continue using Sunny Day Real Estate. And Dan Horner in 1998 said, why change the name? What would be the point of that? It's definitely Sunny Day Real Estate. It's something that persists without Nate. So they pressed on, which was their right move to make, because they were able to hire a new bassist, which was Jeff Palmer, who came from the band Mommy Heads. And then by early 1998, Enoch, Horner, Goldsmith, and Palmer all entered the studio, recorded the band's third album, which was released September of 1998 on Sub Pop, called How It Feels to Be Something On, which marked this bold evolution for the band. Fans were still connected. They were able to be gone, have some mysterious weirdness with their Pink album, come back. And even though they had been separated throughout all of that time, they weren't creating together. They were able to create something fresh, new, to evolve and still stay true to their sound, which not all bands can do very well. So while it does sound almost like a different band than Diary, and like it was this bit of rebirth, it kind of was a different band. It was a different group of people. Like they were different than where they were with Diary. The songs are gentle. They're more intricate. They're kind of spiritual. There's still this soft, heavy, there's still this connection, right? It's softer. It's more melodic, but there's still kind of that punk undertone that they had early on. One reviewer noted that Enoch, and how his sound changed this album, no longer relied on the loud, soft grunge dynamics to carry emotion, but instead he could convey intensity with pure vocal passion. So hitting radiant high notes that evoked comparisons to Jeff Buckley or even Led Zeppelin's Robert Plant. So he wasn't so like such a hard contrast, but was able to still find the contrast in a different way. And you can hear it if you listen to the albums separately. It's really interesting. Their songwriting had also matured and evolved. So they were able to create complex rhythms, unusual time signatures, the cleaner layered guitar tones, replace much of the old punk distortion. They have the track Every Shining Time You Arrive, where they channel this kind of ecclesiastical beauty, which is really interesting. And they also have the title track, How It Feels, which actually began as one of the ideas for Enoch's solo project before being brought kind of back into the band. So you see a lot more of him and kind of that poetic style there. Looking at Every Shining Time You Arrive lyrics, we have a change in every little desire. We were counting on forces we could not control. Oh, and all those things you realized were nothing more than a memory displaced through, so the stories told beyond our grasp. We were climbing on forever an infinite task, shoulders straining with the endless toil. We're nothing more than a feather moving in the wind. I want to change everything. I want to change everything. I want to blame everything on. Oh, and all these seeds will grow anyway, even though the outcome we cannot say. So you'll always have your time to shine, even in the winter of your darkest hour. I want to change everything. I want to change everything. I want to blame everything on. In the depths of my gloom, I crawl out for you. From the peaks of my joy, I crawl back into. Lay me down every time you smile, every shining time you arrive. You arrive, you arrive. 2 promises, long days caught in his room, trapped in the gloom of the dying light. His heart pleads through the wounds that he bleeds, the wounds he never can close. Wrong way, mind in a haze. Never know what he could do. He thinks I gave her my heart. She's tasted my soul. Now she's gone again. He thinks I gave her my heart. She's tasted my blood. Now she's gone again. Long days alone with his shame, fanning the flames of desire. His heart breaks as his memory plays, images of her betrayal. Wrong way his mind in a rage. Never know what he could do. He thinks I gave her my heart. She tasted my soul. Now she's gone again. He thinks I gave her my heart. She's tasted my blood. Now she's gone again. Why did you leave me here? How could you leave me down here? He can't decide where to go then. Two promises, one imperfect. Walls he's building keep on crumbling down. Walls are falling, trying to keep them sound. Long days, he thinks the time will be soon. Pacing his room with his dark thoughts, his heart breaks at the road he must take, the road that will lead to the end. Wrong way, he thinks it's right for release. He'll never know peace in his lifetime. He thinks I gave her my heart, she tasted my soul, now she's gone again. He thinks I gave her my heart, she's tasted my blood, now she's gone again. He can't decide where to go then. Two promises are imperfect. Walls he's building keep on crumbling down. Walls have fallen, there is no sound. Still very poetic. They also had other songs like the opener Pillars. I love Pillars. I'm very interested in it. It scratches my brain in a very good way. But that features more of a hypnotic bass line with the restrained drumming, building patiently to this kind of soaring crescendo. It has a build and a flow to it that's so interesting. And Enoch in the song does kind of reach this roar, like the climax of the song, but it's carefully placed with more of an emotional pink versus like this kind of constant mode, which is very interesting. It's a very beautiful record and showcases that maturity and growth from that unique sound that they had created early on, which is so interesting, especially in this emo space. And I think we can see that definitely influencing like a dashboard confessional down the road. So lyrically, Enoch moved even further from the oblique angst of diary into the introspective and spiritual territory of this album. He was grappling with the big questions of identity and faith on songs like The Prophet, which he then delivered in a single improvised take, channeling a kind of spiritual fervor, as well as Two Promises. But meanwhile, Dave Horner took the opportunity to inject some of his own conviction. So he wrote the song 100 Million, which is a blunt commentary on consumerism and environmental destruction. The mantra of pay for everything, lamenting how from birth to death, every aspect of life gets commodified. So you can see this way that the band members, they grew, they did their own thing, they separated, and they brought what they learned back. They didn't just try to create what they had before, which I think is really special, really interesting. And what's really interesting here is that the social commentary and kind of this belief in the values of Horner were actually part of why they got the name that they did. He was part of it. So Sunny Day Real Estate was chosen because Dan Horner joked that someday even something as pure as a sunny day might be for sale. So he kind of had, that's a very punk thing to say, especially today. So they began to broaden their worldview. It showed up in their tone, the emotive rock, and not just about personal heartbreak, but about seeking meaning, finding a place, understanding society, connecting with it. That maturity, was real and allowed them to still have that kind of emotional core that fans were really connected to and created more of that intimacy with their fandom and how their fans had also grown and matured. So it's almost like they created another movement, and they kind of threaded another piece of this kind of emo scene that was so incredibly special. And as it should have been, the album received positive reviews. It's been regarded as a high water mark for the band and some of the best things that they've ever accomplished, even since Diary, if not more so than Diary. And in addition to that, Enoch's kind of growth as a frontman and the songwriting, they won over critics. which may have dismissed them as kind of those emo kids in the past. Like they were able to open even more new doors. And by late 1998, they were touring again, supporting the new record. And they had not expected that to happen. Fans had not expected that to happen. They were able to bring on Joe Skyward of the Posies to replace Jeff Palmer on bass during the tour, which then allowed them to solidify their lineup. They even considered to do more press interaction. So they changed from kind of that secretive 1994 era that they were in. They even filmed a live concert video and album in May of 1999, which was then released as the album Live by Sub Pop later that year. But the band complained that they weren't really given final say on the mixes or the artwork, and the tensions between them and their label continued to grow and linger. But even amidst that, this record did stand as a document of the band's powerful live presence. It was able to showcase that not only could they produce a studio album and create in the studio and, record something, but they could also be present live and perform live, which is hard to do, especially as a band that had not been together very long to begin with, and then to have a separation like they did. And so this album Live was kind of able to showcase that and even broaden their reach more. So by the end of 1999, having fulfilled their contract with Sub Pop, they decided to move on from that indie label, as they probably should have, and then instead go to something bigger. So they parted ways with their long-term manager and signed to Time Bomb Records, which was an independent label with a major label distribution through Arista Records. So with that new label behind them and more kind of creative momentum on their side, like fans on their side, they decided to make their most ambitious album yet, which gives us The Rising Tide and their second up. So by the year 2000, Sunny Day Real Estate, now Enoch, Horner, and Goldsmith, with Enoch covering bass in the studio, released their fourth studio album, which was called The Rising Tide. So Diary gave us that kind of raw emotional outpouring of a young band. How It Feels was more of that introspective rebirth. The Rising Tide was Sunny Day Real Estate's bid for that grandiosity, that big rock transcendence, the big arena sound. And they teamed up with the producer Lou Giordano. And they went off to Dreamland Studio in upstate New York at the end of 1999, crafted the album, and then released it in 2000. So with this album, apparently they did really well, like creating the songs. They were able to put together 30 songs. They whittled them down, put together this record. They were able to create something that was expansive, that was hopeful. It was more polished. It felt big. It was definitely towards kind of arena rock sound with the elements of this progressive rock and more of the kind of symphonic touches that they had sort of played around with, but now had like the money, the time, the space, the producer to make happen even more and take it to the next level. In this album, the songs reference the imagery of rain, angels, and oceans, kind of giving this cohesive conceptual feel by seeking like the light amongst the storm. So they were still aiming for this bit of contrast that looked different than it looked early on, but was still present in its own way. It evolved in a really beautiful way. The opening track, Killed by an Angel, has this dramatic intensity, and you immediately hear the difference where Goldsmith's drums are hitting a lot harder. Horner's guitar riffs are more like an anthem. Jeremy Enoch sings with a soaring, clear voice that rings out above instrumentation. In this album, his vocals are often compared to John Anderson of Yes or even Bono of U2, kind of showcasing this sort of ethereal, high range, passionate delivery. So this is where they're still emo, right? That's still kind of part of their foundation and their core, but they leaned a lot more into the progressive rock space, and you can hear more of a progressive rock influence behind them and through the songs. But they still were able to kind of balance these grand ambitions with their signature emotional intensity. And even looking at the title track, The Rising Tide, This swells from this kind of gentle hymn-like beginning into a triumphant chorus that feels like a sunrise breaking through the clouds. So it's very like stirring, cinematic, and still very poetic looking at the lyrics. Color your skin with gold and the violence remains. Color your eyes with rose, but the stain remains. Will you escape your life with all the walls you build? Smother your will and lead you into fashion. Morning comes in the dream before we rise. When we linger side by side, it's my heart that speaks this time. We will ride the rising tide. Color your skin with gold, and the violence remains. Cover your eyes with rose, but the stain remains. Will you repair your life with all the holes you fill? Smother your will and drain you of your passion. Morning comes in the dream before we rise. When we linger side by side, it's my heart that speaks this time. We will ride the rising tide. Color your skin with gold, and the violence remains. Cover your eyes with rose, but the stain remains. Will you defend your life for all the hope you feel, or smother your will and lead you into fashion? So the critical reaction to the rising tide was mostly positive overall. They had, a lot of praise from reviewers with the crisp production, the evolution of the vocals, and it was even an album like it made it to the charts. So they were able to hit 97 on the Billboard 200, which was still modest, but like much higher than what they had ever seen in their career. And they had high expectations. They poured their soul, they poured their hearts into it, and they decided to do a lengthy US tour to support the record. So it seemed like, for the first time, they may be getting like the wider recognition that they had always wanted, that they were going to be successful. But unfortunately, fate intervened. So, despite the distribution through the industry and through the records themselves, Time Bomb's promotional push for the album faltered badly. So, advertising was still lacking, and the album's release was undermined by distribution problems and poor marketing overall. So, this led to them, playing their hearts out as much as they could, but without the strong support, they found that the album didn't rise, for lack of a better term, as high as they hoped in terms of sales. So they sold about 67,000 copies in the first year, and it just wasn't enough. So they had originally planned on, after the US tour, embarking on like a European tour, but it fell through. And by June of 2001, the familiar pattern repeated itself. Sunny Day Real Estate announced that they were breaking up once again. This time, the reasons were mostly business related and management related. So instead of tensions within band members, it was like tensions of the band versus like all of the business side of things. They had given, the 4 albums that they could. They had been, trying to stick with this on and off again thing for about a decade at this time. And they decided, just like before, that they were suddenly just done. They were a band one day, the next day they were not. So by mid 2001, they were gone, they were faded, but their legacy was already firmly planted and cemented in the underground music world and in the emo scene. So in the wake of their second dissolution, so in the wake of their second breakup, each member went their separate way once again. So Horner went back to his farm life, which he interestingly still stayed connected in the music scene this time. So he actually collaborated on a few songs with a young emo star named Chris Carrabba of Dashboard Confessional, which you definitely hear in his music, which was his way of kind of passing the torch to the next generation of emo. Enoch and Goldsmith did stick it out together. So in 2001, they actually reunited with Nate Mendel to form a new band called The Fire Theft, which was Sunny Day Real Estate minus Dan Horner. So it was Jeremy, William, and Nate when the Foo Fighters schedule allowed for Nate to be part of it. And they decided not to use the Sunny Day Real Estate name, even though legally they could have. They decided to kind of change it up. They wanted to start fresh without the baggage of the past and like that name behind them. And so they released a self-titled album in 2003, which carried forward some of that same kind of Sunny Day, like grand melodic style. Fans connected to it. They got a decent response from that. And it was like this kind of fire of Sunny Day Real Estate continuing to burn. But little did anyone know Sunny Day Real Estate would make it back again. But first, the emo scene, the emo world was going to explode, and their influence would be part of that and grow in ways that no one really saw coming. So, once again, in their death, they were admired and fans wanted them even more. So by the early 2000s, the new wave of emo and indie rock bands were breaking into the mainstream. So we had Jimmy World, Dashboard Confessional, My Chemical Romance, The Used, Taking Back Sunday, Brand New, all these bands that we've talked about in our episodes. And they talked, like the artists in these bands often spoke so reverently and like respectfully of the 90s bands that paved the way. And Sunny Day Real Estate was frequently cited as a key influence. MTV News in 2006 declared that emo stars worship them, wondering whether a Sunny Day reunion might happen, given kind of this legend status with these younger bands that were exploding. So Chris Carrabba of Dashboard Confessional, which is one of the biggest emo acts in the early 2000s, we are going to do a deep dive on him for sure. But he was such a fan that he actually sought out Dave Horner, the farmer, to collaborate and wrote some songs with him. His confessional acoustic style like drew inspiration from that raw honesty that Sunny Day pioneered. Bands like the Get Up Kids and Thursday also kind of pointed to Sunny Day Real Estate as a formative influence on their own sound, which you can definitely hear, even looking at the Diary album and then looking at Thursday, like you can kind of feel that connection. Hawthorne Heights, which became really popular in the mid 2000s, said a real emo band is like Sunny Day Real Estate or the Get Up Kids. We're definitely influenced by those bands. They were part of kind of that Midwest emo movement. And then the emo revival that swept through the 2000s really did owe a debt to Sunny Day Real Estate and the albums, especially Diary. Dan Horner, looked back on this in 2022 and said, "It's always amazingly humbling. I'm such a fan of music myself. I love My Chemical Romance. And to know that those guys love Sunny Day, it's so humbling." So there's a mutual respect kind of between these. So while Sunny Day Real Estate hadn't necessarily lasted and they came out of two eras where their success wasn't what they expected it to be. These bands that were hitting massive levels of success in the explosion of emo were giving them the respect and like the reverence that they deserved for what they did to pave the way for these bands and the scene as a whole, which is so interesting. And that's why they were kind of given this title of the architects of emo. And Dan Horner in that 2022 interview also said, "Nobody in Sunny Day is like, we're the architects of emo. We laugh at the concept. We know that music is just a river and we're just like a leaf in the stream. It's just funny that emo has gotten and stayed so popular over the last 20 plus years. So it's fun to have a couple of albums that are considered cornerstones of the genre. At the end of the day, we just feel lucky to have been able to make songs that we made." Sounds like a nice little like farmer living in the countryside, enjoying his land. But it's so special because while they may not have taken on that term, like to be able to have mutual respect with these bands that have seen such huge success and have commercialized emo and like created a new wave of emo and like the popularization of emo, like it's amazing to see that respect there. We don't even see that respect among a lot of fans in these different spaces, but you definitely see it with these bands, which is really great. And that is where we got our second reunion. So just like before, the fans wanted more. They became more popular in their break. And so in the late 2000s, the climate was ripe for a Sunny Day Real Estate comeback. We saw emo's popularity at an all-time high. Many of the genre's forebears were reuniting for tours. Sunny Day Real Estate themselves had left a huge question mark with that unreleased material that they had created in 2001. And so the whispers were growing louder and louder in the fan forums. And finally, in the spring of 2009, they became a reality. Sunny Day Real Estate announced a reunion with all four original members on board and there. So Jeremy Enoch, Dan Horner, William Goldsmith, and Nate Mendel, who was taking a break from the Foo Fighters, were reconvening for the first time since 1995. So sent shockwaves of joy through the emo community. And one Seattle radio DJ broke the story in June 2009, confirming that Sunny Day Real Estate was not only returning, but also planning live shows. So for the generation of fans that never got to see the band for the first time, like this was a chance of a lifetime. And we see that. I've seen that with bands I never got to see younger. They break up. It feels like it's never going to be an option. And now it finally is. And that was something almost this band being like this like very mysterious legend in the space. Like now they're available and you can be part of it. When you never thought that that would be possible, which is so special. So they kicked off the full US tour in September 2009, and they actually treated some lucky fans to a surprise secret warm-up show in Tacoma, Washington, the night before the tour. So they actually played under a fake name at a tiny club, which is so interesting. I'm curious if even like Under Oath, they just did the Locust Ultra, like Band in Masks, different name to debut their new album. Like, did they get that inspiration from this band? Did Sunny Day Real Estate get the inspiration from someone else? But very interesting and a fun way to kind of showcase some virality. Right now we had YouTube, we had MySpace, like we had the availability of even social media to start kind of digging into that viral world. And this is a viral moment, but also a great way to practice and find your sound before the full tour. I'm sure that they were nervous. Like I would be nervous, like coming back and to a new group of fandom and all the hype, that was waiting for you there. That's a lot. So once the tour actually began, it was very clear that their legend had only grown during their absence. So most shows sold out, and the band found themselves playing bigger venues than ever before. In an Inlander interview, Dan Horner said, "All the shows are selling really well or sold out. It looks like this is probably going to be the biggest tour we've ever done." So in a surreal turn, Sunny Day Real Estate was invited to perform on network television once again, appearing on Late Night with Jimmy Fallon in September 2009 to play Seven, that same song that they debuted on national TV 15 years earlier. They also topped festival bills that would have been unthinkable in the 90s. So 2010, they played Coachella, not just Warped Tour, Coachella, one of the world's biggest music festivals. They were able to finally get to Europe and tour there. They performed at Spain's Primavera Sound and a sold out show in London. They were supposed to play a Belgian punk festival as well, but the Icelandic volcano's ash cloud grounded flights, which was bizarre, kind of funny, really sad for fans. But they would have gotten there. They were headlining festivals. They were doing it. They were there. They were in the scene. And it was a long, long way from refusing to play KROQ's Christmas show in 1994. Like this time, the band was embracing the appreciation that was coming their way, and they were fully in it. So even more thrilling for the fans, the reunited Sunny Day Real Estate debuted brand new music on the 2009 tour. They often included a freshly written song titled 10 in their set list, which was moody, it was driving, it was able to showcase that kind of inspiration that was growing and flowing for the band at the time, and maybe even a new evolution of their sound. On stage, Enoch was hinting that new songs were coming soon, really stoking the hopes that a fifth Sunny Day Real Estate album might be on the horizon. In interviews, the band confirmed it. And in early 2010, Dan Horner shared that they were actually writing a new album and aiming to hit the studio by that May. So early 2010, they're ready to go, gotta go to the studio. Things are looking up. A new album is coming. So the emo faithful, their fans, could hardly contain their excitement. And they were, questioning, like, this just seems way too good to be true, which unfortunately, as had happened before, was true. And things didn't last. So after the touring of 2009 and early 2010, including that Australian run in the Soundwave Festival, things grew quiet. So Nate Mendel had kind of balanced the reunion with the main gig in the Foo Fighters, but he needed to return full-time to Foo Fighters. And the remaining Sunny Day members decided to move ahead with the recording, and they actually convened at the Foo Fighters Studio 606 in Los Angeles. to work on new songs. That kind of came to Nate and like kind of blended that a little bit. But unfortunately, the sessions did not go smoothly as we have seen in prior albums with this band and these band members. So tensions and scheduling conflicts were creeping up. Communication was fraying. And according to Nate Mendel, the process simply fell apart before the album could be completed. In a 2013 Music Radar interview, he said, "We spent a lot of time writing an album's worth of songs and then went to record in Los Angeles. And the recording process just fell apart. So that was probably the end of that band. If we couldn't make any new music, what's the point?" So this confirmed what the fans had already began to suspect, which is that the reunion had burned so brightly in 2009, but fizzled out quietly by 2011. The album that might have been remained unfinished, tucked away in a hard drive somewhere. And years later, drummer William Goldsmith would dramatically accuse the Foo Fighters' Dave Grohl, the Dave Grohl, of somehow holding the album hostage by not giving the band more time at Studio 606, saying the recordings were abandoned and buried within the murkiest depths of Dave Grohl's sock drawer. Now, Grohl's camp denied any ill intent. Goldsmith clarified that he mainly felt Enoch hadn't gotten the support he needed during those sessions. But this kind of intra-band drama spilled onto social media in 2018, illustrating that even decades later, Sunny Day Real Estate's members were not immune to interpersonal strains. They were on again, they were off again. Maybe they were not actually compatible, even though they tried. So in the end, fans did not get a new Sunny Day Real Estate album, but they did get a song, at least one song, and it arrived in a very unconventional way. So in April 2014, the band released a song called Lipton Witch on a split 7-inch vinyl with fellow emo band Circa Survive. Lipton's Switch was a tout riff-heavy track that had been recorded during those sorted album sessions. It marked the first official new Sunny Day Real Estate music in 14 years, which is a big deal. So it was just a single song, but it had this kind of tantalizing glimpse into what the band had been working on and what could have been. So fans cherished it. The limited vinyl quickly sold out, could probably be sold for a lot of money right now. And it seemed like Lipton Witch might be the final epitaph on Sunny Day Real Estate's career. So it might have been the end, this long song emerging from the rubble of that failed reunion. After 2010, the members once again went their separate ways. Enoch continued a quiet solo career, releasing a couple more solo albums. Goldsmith played with other projects. Mendel, of course, kept rocking their arenas with the Foo Fighters. Sunny Day Real Estate went dormant once more. But fourth time's a charm. There was another reunion. So if we've learned anything from the story, Sunny Day Real Estate has a habit of coming back to life when you least expect it. And that is what happened in January of 2022. More than a decade since the band's last performance, out of nowhere, a new Instagram account under the name Sunny Day Real Estate appears online, posting these kind of cryptic hints. So fans perked up. Was the band going to reunite again? What was going on? And indeed, within days, Spin Magazine confirmed that Sunny Day Real Estate were reuniting for a 2022 tour. This time it would involve Jeremy Enoch, Dan Horner, and William Goldsmith, the core trio, but without Nate Mendel, who was still committed to the Foo Fighters, and some lingering frustrations maybe that were being hinted at from that last writing production process. But the news was still huge. Sunny Day Real Estate was coming back together for the first time in 12 years. They'd be revisiting all eras of their music for a new generation of fans, like they were coming back. And this tour was extensive and highly anticipated. In September 2022, they played their first comeback show in Spokane, Washington, which was at the Big Dipper, a cozy venue which was co-owned by Dan Horner. So made sense. Tickets for that intimate warm-up gig sold out instantly. Horner joked that even as the local music editor, he couldn't snag one in time. And then from there, Sunny Day Real Estate embarked on a full North American tour with the Appleseed cast as support. They played dozens of dates through late 2022. Many shows sold out. The band's cult following rejoiced, finally hearing the classics like In Circles and Seven all performed live again. And Dan Horner in that 2022 interview said, 30 years we've been together now. And we've just grown into really nice friendships that have stood the test of time and a lot of turbulence over the years. We are very emo people, so we definitely have a lot of bumpy parts of the ride. But I think that at the end of the day, we've always just been brothers and friends, and the music itself just keeps drawing us back. So, unlike past reunions, the band members seemed especially kind of reflective and grateful this time around. It seemed like they were coming together in a different way. Maybe post COVID, I think a lot of people experienced this kind of reawakening of what matters and like the connections that they had. And this tour felt more like a celebration of everything that they had endured, everything that they had created, kind of the recognition finally for what had already been done versus just waiting for what was going to come next. So, as of this episode, today, 2025, Sunny Day Real Estate story is still unfolding. The 2022 reunion not only allowed the band to kind of bask in the respect that they've long deserved and that they've gotten, but it also set the stage for new creative chapters. So, they did tease early 2024 a snippet of a new song on social media. And then they did release a previously unheard track called Novum Vetus, which originated from old writing sessions, which maybe is showcasing that songwriting is alive again. They did bring on two new full-time band members for touring, bassist Chris Jordan and guitarist Greg Surin to fill out the lineup. So kind of bringing them back as a five-piece musically powerful band. So who knows? Will they stick around this time? Will there be new music? Will they continue to give fans a reflection into the past and what they've already done? What will happen? Time will only tell. But if anything is true from their history, it's that this year might be a special year. So keep your eyes out. If you've never heard of Sunny Day Real Estate, go reflect over some of the past albums, like go through the storyline with them through the albums. Hopefully, this history will allow you to kind of appreciate them in a unique way and embrace the band now in a very unique way. And then in our next episode, we will continue our exploration through histories of emo, how the genre has evolved, how it has expanded, and the bands that have made it so incredibly special to us as fans and those that get to enjoy it today. So, thank you for showing up, and I'll see you in the next class.